The image is stuck in our heads. The Neanderthal, a hulking, brutish figure maybe dragging a club. A dim-witted caveman standing in the shadow of the smart, sleek newcomers, Homo sapiens. Us. The story we told ourselves for a long time was simple. We showed up and they faded away. We were smarter, faster, better. It was an evolutionary knockout. We won, they lost. End of story. But that story is too simple. It's too neat. The more we learn about our closest extinct relatives, the more that clean narrative falls apart. Neanderthals were not the slow, stupid creatures of our cartoons. They were survivors. They thrived across a huge swath of Eurasia for over 300,000 years. They endured ice ages that would make our modern winters look like a mild spring. They were skilled hunters, masters of their environment. They made complex tools, cared for their sick and elderly, and likely buried their dead with purpose. They were a successful species, a testament to resilience. And then, around 40,000 years ago, they vanished. Their disappearance coincides almost perfectly with the arrival of modern humans in Europe. The timing is so precise, it feels like an open and shut case. We were the murder weapon. But a good detective knows that correlation isn't causation. Just because we were at the scene of the crime doesn't mean we pulled the trigger. Maybe something else was at play. Maybe something much bigger, older, and more powerful had already mortally wounded them. Maybe the real killer was the planet itself. The question has shifted. It's no longer just about us versus them. It's about what happened to the world they both inhabited. Was climate change the real force that pushed the Neanderthals into extinction? To understand their end, we have to understand their world. The Neanderthal era, the Pleistocene, was not a stable time. We call it the Ice Age, but that name is a bit misleading. It suggests one long, continuous deep freeze. The reality was far more chaotic. The Earth's climate wasn't just cold, it was violently unstable. Think of a faulty thermostat, constantly swinging between extremes. For tens of thousands of years, the climate of Europe would flip, and it would flip fast. Scientists see this in the climate records drilled from Greenland's ice sheets and pulled from deep ocean sediments. They have names for these events. There were Dansgaard-Oeschger events, or DO events, where temperatures in the northern hemisphere could shoot up by as much as 10 to 15 degrees Celsius in just a few decades. A human lifetime. Imagine the climate of London suddenly becoming the climate of southern Spain. Forests would surge north, grasslands would appear where there was once ice, and the animals would follow. Then, just as abruptly, the system would snap back. The cold would return with a vengeance. Then there were the Heinrich events. These were even more extreme. As massive ice sheets over North America grew, they became unstable. Huge armadas of icebergs would break off and drift across the Atlantic. As these icebergs melted, they dumped colossal amounts of fresh, cold water into the ocean. This fresh water disrupted the ocean currents, like the Gulf Stream, that act as the planet's circulatory system, bringing warm water north. With that heat pump switched off, Europe and the surrounding regions plunged into intense, dry, and brutally cold conditions that could last for centuries. This was the world the Neanderthals mastered. They were a cold-adapted people. Their bodies show it. They were shorter and stockier than modern humans, with a barrel-chested build and shorter limbs. This was a classic biological adaptation for conserving heat, a lower surface area to volume ratio. Their large, wide noses were likely an adaptation for warming and moistening the cold, dry air they breathed. They weren't just surviving the cold, they were built for it. Their entire way of life was tuned to this environment. Archaeological evidence shows us they were apex predators. They were highly effective hunters of large and medium-sized mammals. Woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, bison, wild horses, reindeer. These animals were their lifeblood. Their bones provided marrow, their hides provided clothing and shelter, and their meat provided the high-calorie fuel needed to survive in the cold. Their hunting methods were a testament to their skill and bravery. They used heavy, stone-tipped thrusting spears. This means they weren't throwing projectiles from a safe distance. They were getting up close and personal with huge, dangerous animals. They had to know the landscape intimately. They had to know their prey's behavior, their migration routes, their weaknesses. They were specialists, perfectly adapted to hunting big game in the Ice Age forests and steppes of Europe. For hundreds of thousands of years, the strategy worked. It worked brilliantly. They expanded their range from the Middle East to the shores of the Atlantic, from the Mediterranean to the edge of the Siberian plains. They weathered the climate's mood swings. When the ice advanced, they retreated south. When it warmed and the ice retreated, they followed the herds back north. They were tough, resilient, and intelligent. But around the time they started to disappear, something changed. The climate wasn't just swinging, it was going haywire. The period between about 60,000 and 30,000 years ago saw some of the most rapid and extreme climate shifts of the last ice age. We see a series of severe Dio and Heinrich events. The world was in a state of constant, unpredictable flux. This wasn't a slow, gradual change they could adapt to over generations. This was climate whiplash. Imagine you're a Neanderthal hunter in what is now southern France. Your whole life and the lives of your ancestors has been based on understanding the local forests and the herds of red deer that lived there. You know where to find them in summer, where they shelter in winter. Suddenly, in the span of your lifetime, a Heinrich event kicks in. The average temperature plummets, the forest, begins to die off, replaced by a vast open frozen steppe. The deer are gone. In their place are herds of reindeer or bison, animals you're less familiar with. The old hunting grounds are useless. The old knowledge is obsolete. You have to move, or you have to learn a whole new way of life, and you have to do it now. And then, a few centuries later, it flips back again. This environmental chaos would have been devastating. Neanderthals lived in relatively small, isolated groups. Their populations were never very large. When the climate went wild, their world would have fragmented. A vast forest might break up into small, isolated patches separated by barren steppe. A herd of mammoths might be wiped out in one region, cutting off a key food source for a local group. A population of Neanderthals living in a mountain valley could be cut off by expanding glaciers, isolating them completely. Small, isolated populations are incredibly vulnerable. They are susceptible to inbreeding, which can reduce genetic fitness over time. They are also at risk of simple bad luck. One bad winter, one failed hunting season, one disease outbreak could be enough to wipe out an entire group, with no neighbors to help or to repopulate the area. The archaeological record seems to support this. As we get closer to their extinction, the Neanderthal world looks less like a continuous territory and more like a series of disconnected islands of habitation. They are being squeezed. The stable ground they had relied on for millennia was crumbling beneath their feet. It was into this world of chaos and crisis that modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived. We emerged out of Africa and spread across the globe. By around 45,000 years ago, we were at the doorstep of Neanderthal territory in Europe. And we were different, not necessarily better in some absolute sense, but different in ways that may have given us a crucial edge in a time of radical instability. Look at our bodies. We were lankier, taller, built for warmer climates, and for covering long distances efficiently. We were endurance runners. Our physiology might have been less suited to the deep cold, but it was well suited to a more mobile lifestyle across varied landscapes. We weren't cold weather specialists, we were generalists. Our technology was different too. Neanderthals perfected their Mousterian toolkit, a versatile set of stone flakes, hand axes, and points. It was effective and reliable, so much so that it remained remarkably consistent for over 200,000 years. But it was a toolkit for close quarters work. Modern humans arrived with a more diverse and rapidly innovating toolkit. We had blades, which are more efficient to produce from a core of stone than flakes. More importantly, we had clear evidence of projectile weapons. We developed spear throwers or atlatls. An atlatl is essentially a lever that dramatically increases the range and velocity of a thrown spear. This is a game changer. A Neanderthal had to risk life and limb getting close to a mammoth. A human could hurl a deadly projectile from a much safer distance. This not only reduced the risk of injury or death, but also expanded the range of animals that could be hunted effectively. You could take down faster animals, smaller animals, and even birds. This points to a bigger difference in our diet. While Neanderthals certainly ate plants and smaller animals when available, the chemical analysis of their bones shows they were hypercarnivores, at the very top of the food chain. Their diet was heavily focused on large terrestrial mammals. Modern humans, by contrast, were supreme generalists. We ate everything. The archaeological sites left by early modern humans are filled with the bones of large mammals, yes, but also rabbits, foxes, fish, shellfish, and birds. We had nets for catching birds, harpoons for fishing, and likely a much more sophisticated knowledge of edible plants. In a stable world, being a specialist like the Neanderthals can be a great strategy. You become the undisputed master of your niche, but when the world is unstable, specialization becomes a liability. If your one main food source disappears, you're in deep trouble. For the generalist, it's a different story. If the mammoths move on, you eat more reindeer. If the reindeer disappear, you fish. If the rivers freeze, you hunt rabbits and birds. This dietary flexibility, this broad spectrum revolution, would have been a massive survival advantage in the flickering climate of late Pleistocene Europe. We had a built-in buffer against environmental change. They had much less of one. There was another, perhaps even more profound difference: our social structures. Neanderthal artifacts are typically found close to their source. The stone they used for their tools usually came from just a few kilometers away. This suggests they lived in more localized, territorially bound groups. Modern human sites from the same period tell a different story. We find seashells hundreds of kilometers from the coast. We find flint tools made from stone quarried from far-off locations. This tells us that we had vast social networks. We were trading, communicating, and interacting over huge distances. These networks were not just for goods, they were for information and for people. It was a kind of social insurance policy. If your group was struggling, you could rely on connections with a group 100 kilometers away that might be doing better. You could exchange knowledge about new hunting techniques or where to find resources. And genins could flow between populations, keeping the overall gene pool healthy. Neanderthal groups seem to have been much more on their own. When a crisis hit one of their small, isolated groups, they faced it alone. We also see an explosion of symbolic behavior with the arrival of modern humans. Intricate cave paintings, carved figurines, personal ornaments like beads and pendants. There's a debate about whether Neanderthals had some symbolic capacity, and the evidence for burials and some simple ornaments suggests they did, but nothing on the scale and complexity of what modern humans were producing. This isn't just about art. This symbolic culture could be the glue that held those large social networks together. Shared rituals, shared myths, a shared identity expressed through adornment. These are the things that allow you to trust and cooperate with a stranger from a different band. It allows you to build a society that is larger and more resilient than just your immediate family. So now, let's put it all together. The scene is set for a tragedy. The Neanderthals, a successful and resilient people, are under immense pressure. Their world is being torn apart by violent climate swings. The forests and steppes they know are transforming before their eyes. Their specialized food sources, the great herds of megafauna, are becoming unreliable, their populations fragmenting and their migration routes shifting. This is forcing the Neanderthals themselves into smaller, more isolated pockets. Their numbers are dwindling, they are stressed, weakened, and vulnerable. And right at this moment of maximum vulnerability, a new human population arrives on the scene. They aren't inherently smarter, but they have a different survival kit. They have projectile weapons that make hunting safer and more efficient. They have a flexible, generalist diet that makes them less susceptible to the collapse of any single food source. And they have wide social networks, held together by a complex symbolic culture, that act as a safety net against hard times. What happened next was likely not a blitzkrieg of violent conquest. There's very little archaeological evidence for widespread warfare between the two groups. It was probably more subtle, a story of slow, grinding replacement. When a modern human group and a Neanderthal group found themselves in the same valley, competing for the same dwindling resources, the humans likely had a slight edge. Maybe their ability to hunt rabbits and fish meant they could sustain a slightly larger population. Maybe their spear throwers allowed them to secure more calories for less risk. Maybe when a brutal cold snap hit, the human group's connections to other groups allowed them to survive, while the isolated Neanderthal group starved. Over thousands of years, these small local advantages would add up. It wasn't one big fight, it was 10,000 small competitions in 10,000 different valleys, spread out over millennia. In some places, the two groups may have coexisted for a time. We know they interbred. Many modern humans with non-African ancestry carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. This is a ghost in our machine, a fossil in our own cells, proving that the story wasn't one of simple annihilation. They didn't just vanish, some of them were absorbed into our population, but as a distinct people, they couldn't hold on. The combined pressure was too much. The climate was the primary antagonist. It pushed them to the brink, shattered their populations, and destroyed the stable world their way of life depended on. We, Homo sapiens, were the final complicating factor. We were the competing species that arrived just as they were at their weakest. We didn't have to be massively superior to win, we just had to be slightly better at weathering the chaos. We were the invasive species that was perfectly adapted to the disturbance. So, was climate change the real Neanderthal killer? The answer is not a simple yes or no. A more accurate answer is that climate change loaded the gun. It created the conditions for extinction. It cornered the Neanderthals and weakened their defenses. Our ancestors, with their different set of social and technological tools, may have been the ones to finally pull the trigger, even if they did so unintentionally, simply by outcompeting their cousins for the last available refuges on a hostile planet. The story of the Neanderthals is more than just an ancient mystery. It's a profound cautionary tale. They were a long-lived, intelligent, and highly adapted species. They were masters of their world for a period of time that makes our entire recorded history look like a fleeting moment. And yet, they are gone. They disappeared because they couldn't adapt quickly enough to a world whose fundamental rules were changing underneath them. Their extinction shows that even hundreds of thousands of years of success are no guarantee of future survival when the environment becomes radically unstable. It's a sobering thought for another intelligent, globally dominant hominin species that is currently facing a new era of rapid, self-inflicted climate change. The ghosts of the Neanderthals remind us that survival is never permanent, and no one is too tough to fail.